Picture this. You're standing on a muddy training ground in feudal Japan, the air thick with the scent of sweat and steel, the shouts of warriors echoing across the dawn mist. Your muscles ache, your hands bleed, and you've been awake for 16 hours straight. But here's the thing, you haven't even touched a sword yet. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about samurai training. Forget the polished movies and video games showing graceful sword forms and meditation gardens. The reality was far more brutal, more psychologically demanding, and more shockingly effective than you can imagine. Because when your life depends on perfect discipline, and your next mistake means dishonor and death, you don't train with wooden swords and gentle philosophy. You train with methods so extreme, so ingeniously designed to break human limitations, that they would hospitalize a modern athlete within hours. The techniques they perfected to master the chaos of warfare hold lessons for ultimate human resilience that would literally break you today. These weren't just warriors, they were master engineers of human performance, creating survival strategies so shocking and so sophisticated that modern science is only now beginning to understand their genius. Over the next 25 minutes, we're going to dive deep into the most brutal training methods that defined the samurai warrior class, each one designed to push human beings beyond their biological limits, to create warriors who could function when normal humans would collapse. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why modern special forces units still study these techniques, and why they're too dangerous for civilian use. Let's start with something that seems innocent enough: sitting. You think you know how to sit? Think again. The samurai practiced seiza, and not for 20 minutes of peaceful meditation. We're talking about maintaining perfect posture, spine straight, weight distributed precisely across your knees, for up to 8 hours without moving a muscle. But here's where it gets diabolical. This wasn't just about posture. Archaeological evidence reveals that samurai would place sharp stones beneath their knees, or balance bowls of water on their heads. One drop spilled, one slight shift in position, and they'd start over. Hour 1, your legs go numb. Hour 2, the pain becomes unbearable. Hour 3, your mind starts playing tricks on you. Hour 4, you're hallucinating from the agony. Modern research shows that this practice was actually rewiring their nervous systems. Dr. Yamamoto's groundbreaking studies on pain tolerance reveal that sustained seiza practice increases pain threshold by up to 400%. It's not just mental toughness, it's literally changing the structure of your brain. Your average modern person would tap out before the first hour ended. But wait, it gets worse. Advanced practitioners would perform seiza while balancing increasingly complex objects. First water bowls, then lit candles, then stacks of porcelain dishes. The psychological pressure was immense. Drop one item, disturb the flame, and you'd face punishment that would make modern military discipline look like a gentle suggestion. The most extreme form was called seiza of the damned. Practitioners would sit in this position on beds of bamboo stakes, with the points pressing into their flesh, just enough to draw blood if they shifted position. The goal wasn't to cause injury, but to create a situation where the slightest movement would result in genuine pain. Hours passed. Blood slowly seeped through their clothing. Their minds entered states of consciousness that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. What they were creating was a warrior who could ignore physical discomfort so completely that battlefield injuries became mere inconveniences. When you've trained your nervous system to function through 8 hours of excruciating leg pain, a sword cut to the arm barely registers. This wasn't just tough training. It was systematic neurological reprogramming. Now, you might think breathing is natural, automatic. The samurai turned it into a weapon of psychological warfare against themselves. They practiced something called death breathing, where they would deliberately hyperventilate to the point of near unconsciousness, then hold their breath until their vision tunneled and their hearts felt like they were going to explode. But wait, it gets worse. They would do this while maintaining perfect sword positions, arms extended, holding wooden training swords that weighed up to 15 pounds. Imagine holding a bowling ball above your head while suffocating yourself, and you're getting close to understanding the horror of samurai respiratory training. Scientific analysis shows this practice was creating controlled hypoxia, essentially training their bodies to function in oxygen-deprived states. When you're in the middle of a battlefield, with smoke filling your lungs and adrenaline burning through your oxygen supply, this training could mean the difference between life and death. Modern Navy SEALs use similar techniques, but even they don't combine it with the physical demands the samurai imposed on themselves. The training progressed through stages that would terrify modern athletes. Stage 1 involved simple hyperventilation while maintaining basic stances. Stage 2 added weight-bearing exercises. Stage 3 incorporated complex sword forms performed while in various states of oxygen deprivation. Stage 4, the level that would break you, required practitioners to engage in actual combat sparring while their brains were starved of oxygen. Picture this. You're already dizzy from hyperventilation. Your vision is blurring. Your heart is pounding irregularly. And now you have to defend yourself against an opponent who's trying to hit you with a wooden sword. Miss a parry because you're lightheaded and you're getting a beating. Show weakness and you start over. The psychological pressure was enormous fear of suffocation combined with fear of physical pain, all while trying to maintain perfect technique. But here's the truly diabolical part. They would practice death breathing in groups, with each warrior responsible for reviving the others if they passed out. Imagine the trust required, the mental fortitude needed to voluntarily surrender, consciousness knowing that your life depends on your training partner's ability to bring you back. Modern medical ethics would never allow such practices, but the samurai saw it as essential preparation for the chaos of real combat. The respiratory training also included what they called winter breathing, practicing these techniques in freezing conditions, often while standing in icy rivers or on snow-covered mountains. The combination of cold stress, oxygen deprivation, and physical exertion created conditions that would send modern athletes to the emergency room. Their bodies learned to function efficiently, even when every biological system was under extreme stress. Here's where the samurai training becomes truly terrifying. They didn't just train their bodies, they systematically destroyed and rebuilt their minds. Young samurai would be placed in complete isolation for weeks at a time, with nothing but rice, water, and their own thoughts. No books, no human contact, no stimulation of any kind. But this wasn't just sitting in a room. These isolation chambers were designed to break down ego, fear, and attachment to life itself. Researchers discovered that many chambers contained deliberately unsettling elements, strange sounds, uncomfortable temperatures, even the smell of death. The goal wasn't meditation, it was psychological demolition. The chambers themselves were engineering marvels of psychological torture. Walls were painted with disturbing imagery, skulls, scenes of death, reminders of the impermanence of life. Sounds were carefully controlled, sometimes complete silence that would drive you mad, sometimes constant dripping or scraping noises that would prevent sleep. The temperature was kept just uncomfortable enough to make rest impossible, but not so extreme as to cause actual harm. What they were creating was a warrior who had already died psychologically, who had faced every possible mental horror in controlled conditions. Modern isolation studies show that most people begin experiencing hallucinations and panic attacks within 48 hours. The samurai spent months in these conditions, emerging with minds so disciplined that fear became a foreign concept. The isolation training progressed to increasingly difficult stages. First, simple sensory deprivation for days at a time. Then, isolation combined with physical discomfort sitting in cramped positions, dealing with hunger and thirst. The final stage involved what they called death contemplation, spending weeks in isolation while surrounded by reminders of mortality, forced to confront their own death until they achieved complete psychological acceptance. But here's what would really break you. The isolation wasn't just about being alone. They would be given impossible mental tasks to complete. Memorizing thousands of lines of poetry, solving complex mathematical problems, or composing their own death poems, all while dealing with the psychological stress of complete isolation. Fail to complete the tasks, and the isolation period would be extended. The mental pressure was crushing. Some chambers included what modern psychologists would recognize as deliberate trauma induction. Practitioners would be forced to relive their worst memories, to confront their deepest fears, to face aspects of themselves they'd rather ignore. The goal was to eliminate psychological weak points, to create warriors who had no mental vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The most extreme form of isolation training involved what they called living death. Practitioners would be placed in coffin-like boxes, barely large enough to contain their bodies, and left for days at a time. The psychological horror of being buried alive, combined with the physical discomfort of confinement, created conditions that would cause permanent psychological damage in most people. The samurai who survived this training emerged with minds that were literally unbreakable. Now we get to the part that would send you running for the hills. You've probably heard of Tamshijiri test cutting. You think it's about slicing through bamboo or straw mats. That's the beginner level. Advanced samurai practiced cutting through materials that would horrify you. They would start with layers of silk. Sounds gentle, right? Wrong. Wet silk becomes incredibly tough, and cutting through 20 layers requires perfect edge alignment and tremendous force. But that was just the warm-up. Advanced practitioners would cut through iron helmets, thick bamboo poles, and even stone. But here's what would break you. The training wasn't just about successful cuts. They were expected to perform these cuts after hours of exhausting physical training, with hands that were already trembling from fatigue. Miss the target, dull your blade, or show the slightest hesitation, and you'd face punishment that makes modern military discipline look like a spa day. The psychological pressure was immense. Every cut had to be perfect, because in real combat, your life depended on that precision. Modern biomechanical studies show that the forces involved in these cutting exercises would cause immediate injury to untrained joints and muscles. Your shoulders would dislocate, your wrists would snap, and your spine would compress under the torque. The progression of cutting training was methodically designed to break human limitations. Week 1 involved cutting through increasingly thick bundles of straw. Week 2 added bamboo poles of varying thickness. Week 3 introduced metal objects, first thin iron rods, then armor pieces, finally full helmets. Each stage required not just strength, but perfect technique, timing, and mental focus. But here's the truly diabolical aspect. They would practice cutting while blindfolded, relying only on their sense of spacing and timing. Imagine swinging a razor-sharp blade with enough force to cut through metal while unable to see your target. One miscalculation, and you could lose a limb. The mental pressure was enormous fear of injury, combined with the shame of failure, all while trying to maintain perfect form. Advanced practitioners would engage in what they called 1,000-cut training, performing 1,000 perfect cuts in a single session, with each cut meeting exacting standards of angle, depth, and clean separation. Your arms would be screaming in agony after the first 100 cuts. Your hands would be bleeding from gripping the sword. Your back would be spasming from the repetitive motion. But you couldn't stop, couldn't show weakness, couldn't let your form deteriorate even slightly. The most extreme form of cutting training involved live targets, condemned criminals who had volunteered for execution. The psychological impact of taking a human life, combined with the technical challenge of making a clean kill, created conditions that would traumatize most modern people. But for the samurai, it was essential preparation for the reality of combat. They needed to know exactly how their blade would feel cutting through human flesh, how their mind would react to taking a life. But wait, there's more. The cutting training wasn't just about individual technique. They would practice group cutting exercises, where multiple samurai would coordinate their cuts to slice through massive objects. Imagine the precision required, the trust in your fellow warriors, the split-second timing needed to avoid accidentally cutting each other. One mistake and someone dies. Think modern ultramarathons are tough? The samurai had something called Musha Shoujo Warrior Pilgrimage. But this wasn't a spiritual journey with comfortable rest stops. This was a month-long ordeal designed to push human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. Picture walking for 16 hours a day, carrying full armor and weapons, sleeping on rocks with no shelter, eating only what you could forage, and doing this while maintaining perfect mental discipline. But here's the kicker along the way. You are expected to seek out combat. Not friendly sparring sessions, but real fights with real consequences. The route would take them through mountains, swamps, and hostile territories. They would deliberately choose the most dangerous paths because comfort was seen as weakness. Archaeological evidence shows that many samurai died during these pilgrimages, but those who survived returned with a level of mental and physical toughness that was almost superhuman. Modern adventure athletes, with their GPS devices, support teams, and carefully planned nutrition, would find these conditions impossible. The samurai did it with primitive equipment, alone, while actively seeking danger. The pilgrimage routes were deliberately designed to test every aspect of warrior training. Mountain passes that would challenge their endurance, river crossings that would test their swimming ability, forests where they'd have to navigate by stars and intuition. Each environment presented unique challenges that would push them to their limits. But here's what would really break you. The pilgrimage wasn't just about physical endurance. They were expected to maintain strict mental discipline throughout the journey. Daily meditation sessions, even when exhausted. Constant awareness of their surroundings, even when sleep deprived. Perfect courtesy to strangers, even when hungry and desperate. The combat aspect of the pilgrimage was particularly brutal. They would seek out known warrior schools, challenge their best fighters, and engage in real combat with real weapons. Lose a fight, and you might not survive to continue the journey. Win, and you'd earned the right to continue, but now you'd have to deal with the psychological weight of having killed or seriously injured another warrior. Some pilgrimages included what they called demon challenges, deliberately seeking out the most dangerous criminals, the most skilled fighters, the most hostile environments. The goal was to push themselves beyond human limits, to find their breaking point, and then surpass it. Many never returned from these challenges, but those who did were considered to have achieved something close to superhuman status. The psychological toll was enormous. Weeks of isolation, constant physical stress, regular combat, and the ever-present possibility of death created conditions that would cause most people to suffer complete mental breakdown. The samurai who completed these pilgrimages emerged with minds that were literally unbreakable. Here's the training that would absolutely destroy you psychologically. Every samurai spent time preparing for seppuku ritual suicide. But this wasn't just learning a ceremony. They would actually practice the physical and mental components up to the point of drawing blood. They would sit in the proper position, with the blade pressed against their abdomen, and contemplate their own death for hours. The psychological training involved accepting death so completely that life became something they held lightly. They would write their death poems, arrange their affairs, and mentally rehearse their final moments. But the truly terrifying part? They would do this regularly, not just once. It was considered essential mental training, like meditation, except instead of finding peace, they were finding the courage to die with honor. Modern psychology shows that this level of death acceptance would require completely rewiring normal survival instincts. The seppuku preparation involved multiple stages of psychological conditioning. First, they would study the deaths of famous samurai, learning every detail of how they faced their final moments. Then, they would practice the physical positions, the proper grip on the blade, the correct angle of penetration. Finally, they would engage in what they called death meditation, extended periods of contemplating their own mortality until they achieved complete acceptance. But here's what would break you. They would practice seppuku preparation while their families watched. Imagine sitting with a blade pressed against your stomach, contemplating your own death while your children look on. The psychological pressure was enormous, not just the fear of death, but the shame of showing weakness in front of those you love. The most extreme form of seppuku preparation involved what they called practice cuts, actually making shallow incisions in their abdomen, just deep enough to draw blood and cause significant pain. The goal was to familiarize themselves with the sensation, to eliminate the shock and fear that might cause hesitation during the actual ritual. Some samurai would practice seppuku preparation in groups, with each warrior serving as kaishu kunin, the person who would deliver the merciful killing blow for the others. Imagine the trust required, the mental fortitude needed to practice decapitating your friends, knowing that they would do the same for you if necessary. The psychological conditioning was so complete that many samurai reported feeling genuine peace during seppuku preparation. They had trained their minds to see death not as something to be feared, but as the ultimate test of their training. This level of death acceptance would be considered pathological by modern standards. But for the samurai, it was the foundation of true fearlessness. Now, let's talk about what might be the most brutal aspect of samurai training, the systematic destruction of their capacity for physical comfort. Modern people complain about sleeping on firm mattresses or dealing with minor temperature variations. The samurai trained themselves to function in conditions that would hospitalize you within days. They would practice sleeping on beds of stones, with sharp rocks pressing into their backs and ribs. Not for one night, but for weeks at a time. The goal was to eliminate their body's need for comfort, to create warriors who could rest anywhere, anytime, regardless of conditions. But wait, it gets worse. They would practice sleeping while maintaining defensive positions, with weapons at the ready, prepared to fight at a moment's notice. Imagine trying to rest while your body is tensed. For combat, your mind constantly alert for threats. The psychological stress would prevent most people from achieving any meaningful rest. The temperature training was particularly brutal. They would practice extended exposure to extreme cold, standing naked in snow for hours at a time. Not just enduring it, but maintaining perfect mental focus while their bodies shut down from hypothermia. Modern cold weather training doesn't even approach these extremes. Summer training involved the opposite extreme, practicing in desert-like conditions with full armor under the blazing sun. Dehydration, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke were constant threats. But showing weakness, seeking shade, or requesting water was considered failure. They had to maintain perfect discipline while their bodies were literally cooking. The pain conditioning was perhaps the most shocking aspect. They would deliberately inflict pain on themselves, not as punishment, but as training. Burning themselves with hot coals, cutting themselves with blades, subjecting themselves to various forms of physical torture. The goal was to become so familiar with pain that it became just another sensation to be ignored. But here's the truly diabolical part. They would practice combat techniques while in pain. Imagine trying to execute perfect sword forms while your body is screaming in agony. The mental discipline required is almost incomprehensible. Yet this was considered essential training, because real combat inevitably involved fighting through injuries. The hunger training was equally extreme. They would practice extended fasting, not just for spiritual reasons, but to train their bodies to function without food. Weeks would pass with minimal nutrition, while still maintaining full training schedules. Your body would be consuming itself for energy, but you still had to perform at peak levels. Water deprivation training pushed them to the edge of death. They would practice functioning while severely dehydrated, learning to ignore the desperate cravings of their bodies. Modern survival training doesn't even approach these extremes, because the risk of permanent damage or death is too high. Let's talk about something that would break your mind before it broke your body: the samurai approach to fear conditioning. They didn't just face their fears. They systematically sought out every possible source of terror and forced themselves to function through it. Height training involved practicing combat techniques on narrow ledges, cliff faces, and unstable structures. Imagine trying to execute perfect sword forms while standing on a beam barely wide enough for your feet, with a 100-foot drop below you. One mistake, one moment of fear-induced hesitation, and you'd plummet to your death. But that was just the beginning. They would practice combat while suspended over spike pits, with death literally inches away. The psychological pressure was enormous fear of falling, combined with the technical demands of perfect technique. Your body would be flooded with adrenaline, your hands would be shaking, but you still had to maintain precise control. Water training involved combat practice while partially submerged, dealing with the constant threat of drowning. They would fight while standing chest-deep in rivers, with their movement restricted and their breathing compromised. Add the psychological stress of potential drowning, and you have conditions that would panic most people into complete inaction. Fire training was perhaps the most terrifying. They would practice combat techniques while surrounded by flames, with burning structures collapsing around them. The heat would be unbearable. Smoke would fill their lungs, but they still had to maintain perfect technique. The psychological horror of being burned alive, combined with the physical demands of combat, created conditions that would cause most people to freeze with terror. But here's what would really break you. They would practice these fear conditioning exercises while blindfolded. Imagine fighting on a cliff edge while unable to see, relying only on your sense of balance and spatial awareness. The terror would be overwhelming, but showing fear was considered failure. The most extreme form of fear conditioning involved what they called death scenario training, practicing combat in situations designed to be psychologically identical to real death situations. Fighting in graveyards at night, surrounded by corpses. Combat practice in torture chambers, with the implements of pain visible around them. The goal was to eliminate any situation that could cause psychological paralysis. Some samurai would practice combat while wearing masks depicting their own death faces, literally fighting while confronting their own mortality. The psychological impact was devastating, but it created warriors who were immune to fear-based psychological warfare. So what would happen if you tried to train like a samurai today? Within the first week, you'd likely be hospitalized. The seiza. Training alone would cause permanent nerve damage in your legs. The breathing exercises would lead to fainting, possibly brain damage from oxygen deprivation. The psychological isolation would trigger panic attacks, depression, and possible psychotic episodes. But here's the shocking truth. The samurai weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who had been systematically broken down and rebuilt through methods so extreme that they transcended normal human limitations. They had discovered that the human body and mind could be pushed far beyond what seems possible, but only through techniques that would be considered torture by today's standards. Modern science is only now beginning to understand the neurological and physiological changes these practices created. The samurai had accidentally discovered advanced techniques for rewiring the nervous system, increasing pain tolerance, and creating unshakable mental discipline. They were using methods that we're just starting to explore in cutting-edge sports psychology and military training. The pain tolerance they developed was literally superhuman. Modern pain management techniques can increase tolerance by perhaps 50%. The samurai training methods increased pain tolerance by 400% or more. They could function with injuries that would incapacitate normal people, not because they were physically different, but because they had rewired their nervous systems to process pain differently. Their fear conditioning was so complete that they could function in situations that would cause most people to freeze with terror. Modern exposure therapy can help people overcome specific phobias, but the samurai had eliminated fear as a limiting factor entirely. They had faced every possible source of terror and trained themselves to function through it. The mental discipline they developed was beyond anything we see in modern athletes or military personnel. They could maintain perfect focus for hours at a time, ignore physical discomfort completely, and make life or death decisions without emotional interference. This wasn't just mental toughness. It was a complete rewiring of how their brains process stress and threat. But perhaps most shocking of all was their death acceptance. They had trained themselves to see death not as something to be feared, but as the ultimate test of their discipline. This level of psychological conditioning would be considered pathological by modern standards, but it created warriors who were literally fearless. The legacy of their training lives on in our genes, our psychology, and our understanding of human potential. These weren't just warriors. They were pioneers of human performance, pushing the boundaries of what's possible when you're willing to sacrifice everything for perfection. Modern special forces units study samurai training methods, but they can't replicate them completely because the risk of injury or death is too high. The samurai accepted that many would die in training because they considered it necessary preparation for the reality of combat. The psychological techniques they developed are being studied by modern researchers who are trying to understand how to create unbreakable mental discipline. The physical conditioning methods they used are being analyzed by sports scientists who want to push human performance to new limits. But here's what they really discovered. The human being is capable of far more than we imagine. The limits we accept, the boundaries we acknowledge, the barriers we consider insurmountable, these are largely psychological constructs that can be overcome through proper training. The samurai proved that pain is optional, that fear is a choice, that comfort is weakness, and that the human spirit is literally indestructible when properly conditioned. They showed us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they're willing to pay the price. The next time you think modern training is tough, remember the samurai. They didn't just train with swords. They trained with methods that would shatter your body, break your mind, and rebuild you into something beyond ordinary human limits. That's what samurai actually trained with, and that's exactly what would break you today. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: they weren't born special. They became special through training methods so extreme that they transformed ordinary humans into something approaching superhuman. They proved that the limits we accept are often just the beginning of what's possible. The question isn't whether you could survive samurai training. The question is whether you're willing to push yourself beyond what seems possible. Because that's where true strength is found, that's where real character is forged, and that's where ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary things. The samurai understood something we've forgotten: comfort is the enemy of greatness. Safety is the enemy of strength. And the only way to discover your true potential is to push yourself beyond what you think you can survive. That's the lesson. They leave us, written in blood and forged in pain, but more valuable than any treasure. That's what samurai actually trained with, and that's what would break you today. But maybe, just maybe, it's also what would make you truly strong.